Have you ever wondered where all of us came from? Before countries, cities, or borders existed, our ancestors lived in Africa. Then some of them began leaving. But here's the mystery. They weren't the first. Earlier humans had already left Africa, and their journeys largely disappeared. So what made one later migration different? Why did they leave? And how did a small group of humans eventually spread across the world? For most of human history, Africa was home. Long before countries existed, small communities of Homo sapiens lived across different parts of the continent, moving with the seasons, searching for food and water, and adapting to forests, grasslands, lakes, and changing climates. And this wasn't one small population living in one place. Evidence from sites such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dating back roughly 300,000 years, shows just how deep the story goes. Our ancestors had already survived enormous changes in their environment. But eventually, some groups began moving beyond Africa. Why? There was probably no single reason. Climate could make some landscapes more difficult while opening others. Animals and water sources moved, resources changed, and as highly mobile hunter-gatherers, humans were capable of following those opportunities. But perhaps the most important point is this. Leaving Africa wasn't one sudden decision. It was a process that happened repeatedly over thousands of years. And the first people who ventured beyond the continent would soon discover that the world outside Africa was very different from the one they knew. Because sometimes, the greatest journeys begin when a landscape that looks impossible suddenly becomes a pathway. Today, the Arabian Peninsula looks like one of the harshest places on Earth. But thousands of years ago, it could look completely different. During wetter periods, parts of Arabia were transformed by lakes, rivers, grasslands, and vegetation. For humans moving out of Africa, these changes could create temporary pathways into Eurasia. And we have clues that they actually used them. At Alathar, researchers discovered human footprints preserved beside the tracks of large animals, dating back roughly 120,000 years. And at Al-Wasta, archaeologists found a Homo sapiens finger bone dating to around 85,000 years ago. These discoveries tell us something important. Humans were leaving Africa far earlier than the traditional story suggested. But these early journeys didn't simply lead to the world we know today. Many of those populations left little detectable ancestry in later non-African humans. So if humans had already found a way out of Africa, why didn't those first journeys change the world? To answer that, we have to follow the people whose journeys almost disappeared from human history. The first humans who left Africa did not simply disappear from history. Some of their descendants may have survived for generations. Others may have been isolated, absorbed into later populations, or eventually vanished as conditions changed. And this is where the story becomes difficult to reconstruct. Archaeologists can find a fossil or an ancient footprint, but DNA can tell us whether that population left a lasting genetic legacy. And when scientists compare ancient and modern genomes, something surprising appears. Most people living outside Africa today descend primarily from a later expansion of Homo sapiens. So the question isn't simply, did humans leave Africa? They clearly did. The bigger question is, why did those earlier movements fail to become the foundation of today's non-African populations? Changing climates may have closed migration corridors. Small populations could have been vulnerable to isolation, disease, competition, or environmental change. And some groups may simply have been absorbed by later populations, leaving only faint traces behind. We may never know exactly what happened to every early traveler. But their disappearance gives us one crucial clue. Leaving Africa was not enough. Something about a later population and the world it entered was different. And that difference may have begun before they ever left Africa. Something had changed before the Great Expansion began. Around 70,000 years ago, evidence suggests that humans in Africa were beginning to use a much wider range of environments, from forests and grasslands to increasingly dry landscapes. This mattered because surviving outside Africa would require more than simply finding a new route. It would require humans who could adapt to almost anything. Different foods, different climates, different landscapes, and perhaps most importantly, different ways of working together. Then, roughly 50,000 years ago, a major expansion of Homo sapiens began to leave a much stronger genetic mark on the populations living outside Africa today. But scientists don't believe there was one simple reason for this success. Climate may have opened the doors. Human adaptability may have allowed them to walk through them. And once they began spreading across Eurasia, their world became much larger. But they were about to encounter something they could never have expected. They were not the only humans on Earth. Across Eurasia, another kind of human had already survived for hundreds of thousands of years. And eventually, our ancestors met them. When Homo sapiens began spreading across Eurasia, they weren't entering an empty world. Neanderthals were already there. They had survived for hundreds of thousands of years across Europe and parts of Western Asia, adapting to cold climates, hunting large animals, and building their own way of life. Then our ancestors arrived, and the evidence suggests this wasn't simply a story of one species replacing another. They met, they interacted, and sometimes they had children together. That's why many people living outside Africa today carry roughly 1–2% Neanderthal ancestry. But Neanderthals weren't the only ancient humans our ancestors encountered. Farther east, another mysterious population lived across parts of Asia. The Denisovans. For years, almost nothing was known about them. Then ancient DNA revealed that they had interbred with modern humans too, and their genetic legacy can still be found in some populations today. So the human journey out of Africa wasn't a simple march into an empty world. It was a meeting between different human populations, and their DNA still lives inside us. But our ancestors didn't stop in Eurasia. They kept moving, and eventually they reached a challenge that required something completely different: crossing the sea, because the next part of the journey would take humans, far beyond the world their ancestors had ever known. The journey didn't end when humans reached Eurasia. They kept moving, across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and eventually toward Sahel, the ancient landmass that once connected Australia and New Guinea. Archaeological evidence suggests humans reached Sahel at least around 65,000 years ago. And that raises another mystery. They didn't have modern ships, maps, or navigation systems. Yet somehow they crossed open water and reached a completely different world. From there, humans continued adapting to new environments. They moved into Europe, into colder regions, and eventually, much later, into the Americas. Everywhere they went, they faced unfamiliar landscapes and somehow found ways to survive. But perhaps the most remarkable part isn't how far they traveled. It's what happened to the people who began the journey. They left Africa as relatively small populations, and over thousands of generations, their descendants spread across enormous parts of the planet. Today, humanity lives in deserts, mountains, forests, islands, and frozen regions. And beneath all that diversity, there is a shared story, a journey that began in Africa. But even now, scientists are finding clues that the story may be more complicated than we imagined. Ancient DNA is revealing traces of mysterious human populations whose identities may have been lost forever. So perhaps we haven't discovered the complete story of our journey yet. Maybe some chapters are still buried in the ground. In the end, we may never know exactly why the first humans walked beyond Africa. Perhaps climate pushed them. Perhaps food and water pulled them forward. Perhaps curiosity played a role. But the evidence tells us something far more remarkable. They kept moving, across changing landscapes, into unfamiliar worlds, and eventually across oceans. Some journeys disappeared. Others changed the course of humanity. And today, wherever you live, whatever language you speak, your story is connected to those ancient travelers. Because before there were countries, before there were borders, there was a journey, and it began with humans willing to step beyond the world they knew. That journey didn't just change where humans lived. It changed what humanity became.